Hi everyone and welcome to Creative Cakes by Sharon. After doing my last tutorial on Anna from Frozen, I simply had to do her magical older sister, Queen Elsa. So the materials I have here today are an 8 by 12 inch cake. I've got some chocolate ganache, I've got my long roller as well as my small roller, a pair of scissors, my pizza cutter, a sharp knife, my X-Acto blade, my offset spatula. I've also got a wooden tool with a pointy tip on the end. I've got an edible marker, some fluffy brushes to use today. I've got some flour glue as well, and I've got a couple of extra luster dust that I'm using today. I'm using a burgundy for the eyeshadow, the pink to make her cheeks pink, and I've got this silver, ivory and brown, which are not necessary, but I'm just going to highlight her hair with those. And I've also got this set of 3 star plunge cutters that I'm going to use to create little clips for her hair. I've also got my cake smoother, and the fondant I'm using today is some skin colour, a mixture of white and yellow. I've got some black, purple, blue and red, as well as a white, brown and turquoise. I've got here the template for Elsa, which you can find a copy in the description box below, as well as a board which I've already covered with fondant. So let's get started. Here I've got the template of Elsa, which I've just cut at the top of her hair. And I'm just going to cut around the template through the cake, making sure the knife is straight down vertically so that we don't end up with a crooked edge. Now to cut out her ponytail, you can just tailor it to suit how much room you've got on your board. So just maximize the length of her ponytail with the amount of cake you've got, and then just trim the edge of the ponytail so that it sits nice and flush on the side of her face. Once I'm happy with the size of her ponytail, I'm going to taper it so that the top of it is thicker than the bottom. So with my knife I'm just going to gently cut upwards on an angle so that her ponytail looks a bit more natural, with the broader and thicker end at the top tapering down to less hair at the bottom. Now I'm going to cover the face and ponytail with this gorgeous looking dark chocolate ganache, and I'm going to try and get the coating as smooth as possible. It's just a crumb coat, but if you drop the ganache onto the cake nice and thickly and then smooth it over, you'll find that you get less crumbs in your crumb coat. And once I'm happy with the covering, I'm going to pop it in the fridge for about 15 minutes to set. Now I'm just going to smooth over my ganache that has set using some boiling water and my offset spatula. So I soak my spatula in boiling water and then dry off all the excess water with a paper towel, and then gently smooth over the entire surface of the cake, and this will give you a beautiful smooth surface. Now to add some definition to Elsa's face, I'm going to add some raised components, so her ear, nose, cheeks and also her lips and eyebrows. So to do that, we're just going to take some of that skin or flesh coloured fondant and rip off a small piece that's going to form into, first of all, an ear, which I'll then just press onto the side of her face in line with the template, and then do the same for the nose. I'm going to do the bridge of her nose as well as the end of her nose into a pointy little triangle, and 2 round mounds for the cheeks and also both eyebrows, making sure always use the template as a guide. This is going to go under the overall fondant, and it's going to help provide that definition and even some shadow to the overall look of the cake. Now I'm going to position the template on top of the cake and use my wooden tool. You could also use the back end of a paintbrush or toothpick and press over the sections of the template that we've created the little impressions for. So we're just going to trace over the nose, the cheeks, the lips and the eyebrows, just as a guide of where to position those pieces of fondant. And then just go ahead and pop those pieces of fondant onto the cake where the markings are, and then just move the cake to a side so that we can roll out the flesh coloured fondant into a large enough piece that's going to cover the entire cake. Now I'm going to gently put the fondant onto my roller and drape it over the top of the cake. Then it's just a matter of evening out the sides by lifting up the fondant and smoothing down the sides of the cake, and then trimming off the excess just roughly first, making sure you get into all of the grooves and crevices on the top of the cake. Make sure the sides are smooth and do a final trim right up to the edge of the cake. Now I'm going to work on creating Elsa's eyes. So I'm going to cut out the template following the line of the top of her eyelid. So not just the eyeball, we're going to cut all the way around that line. Now that I've cut the eyes out, I've placed the stencil back onto the cake and grabbed my wooden tool, and I'm just going to trace around the inside line of her eye there. So it's going to be a bit of a guide, and I'm also going to use my finger to gently press the fondant down inside that line that we've created around her eyes, so it's a little bit lower than the rest of the fondant. Now I've just grabbed my dark purple fondant and I'm going to create the eyeshadow on Elsa's eyelids. So just a matter of rolling out a long snake and using the template as a guide to form the shape of the eyeshadow, and then position it on the cake. Remember, this is going to go inside the line that we've created on the face because we cut the stencil out around the top of the eyeshadow. Now I'm going to trim down the stencil a little bit more, just going around what would be the whites of her eyes, and then I'm going to roll out my fondant and cut around the stencil to create the whites of the eyes and position them onto the cake. If you need to trim off a little bit of the excess of the white fondant on the cake, just do so with a sharp knife or your X-Acto blade. I'm going to use my wooden tool now to make a depression between the join of the top of the eye and the eyeshadow. I want to press the fondant down here so that it makes a little bit of a groove or a well, so that when I do my eyelashes I can stand them inside this little cavity. Now I'm just going to make a little bit of an impression into the inside of her ear using my tool and my fingers, and also with the blunt end of my tool I'm going to create two little indentations for her nostrils. Make sure you don't poke too hard and make a hole in the fondant here. Now I've got my really deep blue fondant which I'm going to use for the coloured section of her eyes. So it's just a matter of rolling out the fondant, cutting out the stencil around the blue of her eyes and tracing around that and positioning it onto the cake. Now I'm going to work on Elsa's eyelashes. I found this one of the most fun parts of the cake because they really make the cake pop and stand out. So I'm just rolling the fondant out, not too thin this time. I want it to be about 2 mils thick. I'm not sure if you can see that there, but we don't want it too thin because when we cut through each individual eyelash we want it to be strong enough so that it doesn't break apart. So I'm just going to trace over the stencil for the eyelashes, and then with my X-Acto blade I'm going to start at one end and make cuts all the way through the fondant, about 1 mil thick each, and this will represent each eyelash. Take your time doing this and use your finger to hold the fondant in place while you drag your blade away. Now using a fine paintbrush and the flower glue, I'm going to dab some of this into the little cavity or well we created between the top of the whites of the eye and the eyeshadow, and then I'm going to gently pick up the eyelashes and try and stand them in this cavity. Make sure you always support the eyelashes with the back of a paintbrush or a wooden tool or your fingers, because after all the trouble to create the eyelashes you don't want them to snap off and break. To ensure the eyelash is firmly in place, take a wooden tool or your toothpick and press down on the very bottom edge of the eyelashes into that cavity. Now I'm going to quickly create the pupils of Elsa's eyes. You could cut the stencil out and trace around it, but because it's quite a small piece of round fondant, I'm just going to press out a small ball and fix it onto her eyes. If I look at the template now, you can see that Elsa has a dark line that really frames her eyes. So I'm going to use my black marker to gently create that line around the edge of the whites of her eyes, as well as creating some tiny eyelashes at the bottom of each eye. Now I'm just going to adhere 2 tiny balls of white fondant onto the eyes to create the reflection, and then move on to creating the eyebrows. And the easiest way to do that is to take out the brown fondant and roll it into a bit of a snake in your palm, and then use the template as a guide to mold and shape the eyebrows. Once you're happy with the shape of the eyebrows, position them onto the cake, and then using the back of your knife or toothpick, texture the eyebrows so they look a little bit more natural. To make Elsa's lips, I'm using a really deep red coloured fondant, and I have to roll it out very thin because she does have very thin pursed lips in this template. And then I'm just going to cut out the lips from the template and use the stencil to cut out the fondant. Now when I position the lips onto the cake, I'm going to try and use the raised portion that we created earlier as the base for the top lip. So I'm going to make sure that the most of the fondant is on the flat part of the cake, which would be her bottom lip. And then I just used my finger and my wooden tool to shape the lips and make sure all of the edges are nice and smooth, and make sure you press in the gap between the top and bottom so the top lip is going to be more pronounced than the bottom. Now I'm going to add the blushed colour to Elsa's face by using my light pink luster dust as well as a nice fluffy brush, and this part of the cake is really up to you to have fun with, and you just keep adding the luster dust until you end up with a shade that you're happy with. The main areas I concentrated on are her high cheekbones, a tip of her nose, a little bit on her chin, and in the area above her eyelid and eyebrow. Once you're happy with the shade of makeup you've created for her face, you can use the darker coloured burgundy luster dust to go over her purple eyeshadow fondant and also just highlight that region. I'm going to work on now covering the second part of the cake, which was the braid that we made earlier. And I'm going to roll out this white and yellow fondant which I've mixed and kept a bit of a marble effect so we can get a little bit of a two-tone effect in her hair. So I'm just going to roll it out fairly thin and cover that second piece of cake with this and trim off all the excess. And then I'm going to grab my wooden tool and make a series of diagonal lines that go almost 3/4 of the way through the braid. And then I'm going to do the same in the opposite direction. So I've created the impression of a braid. I've just grabbed my board and I'm going to transfer Elsa onto the cake board as well as her braid now, and I'm going to start working on the top section of her hair. So I need to roll out my yellow fondant. You can see there that I've just laid all of my scrap pieces on top of each other because I don't want to blend the colour too much by kneading the fondant further. So once I've got a large enough section of fondant to cover the top of her head, I can cut the stencil following the hairline and then cut around that on my piece of fondant, making sure I leave enough at the top to cover the edge of the cake. In order to position her hair in the right spot, I'm just going to put the stencil on the cake and make a little mark and then gently transfer the fondant onto the cake and smooth down the sides and trim off the excess. Now I'm going to create the wavy fringe, and I'm just going to use all of the scrap pieces of yellow fondant that I have without re-rolling too much to maintain that streaky effect. And I'm going to just freehand cut out leaf shapes out of the fondant, and then with the back of my wooden tool I'm going to create some lines in the fondant to look like strands of hair, and then just gradually build up her fringe and the sides of her hair. I'm going to drape a few strands across her face and down the top part of her plait to make it look as natural as possible and to add as much volume as possible. To create the clips in Elsa's hair, I'm just going to use my turquoise coloured fondant, roll it out and use my star plunge cutters to cut some stars out and scatter them down the length of her braid. The final thing I'm going to do with Elsa is add some of the luster dust that I have, the ivory, silver and brown, to the very edges of her hair. This step is totally optional. I just thought I'd add a bit more shimmer because after all she is Queen Elsa. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial of Elsa. She really was lots of fun to create. You can also check out my tutorial on how to create her younger sister Anna. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to click on the link below to subscribe to my channel for more great video tutorials.